has been going on since about a month ago. Absolutely incredible. Let's talk to Helen Dowler. Helen, very good morning to you. Welcome back.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. Now, it wasn't until a few moments ago that I realised quite how dramatic this online harm bill actually is and how ridiculously powerful it makes Ofcom and how incredibly sort of undetermined the rules and the guidelines actually are.
It's astonishingly badly drafted.
Yeah.
What we've seen of it. Obviously, we haven't seen all of it, and they do change these things in response to community disquiet and also other parliamentarians. That is true. But by the same token, we've all seen during COVID, Parliament get out of the habit of exercising proper scrutiny of government legislation. But at the bottom of this online harms thing is this persistent Tory attempt. I mean, and now, of course, Labour have joined in, that it's the character in The Simpsons. What about the children? Helen Lovejoy. What about the children? What about the children? Forgetting that the primary responsibility for children and their development and what they access on the internet and what they have access to at home and so on and so forth is not in the hands of the government. It's in the hands of their parents. And I mean, if your 12-year-old is looking at porn on the internet, that is probably not a reflection on either the 12-year-old or the porn. It's a reflection on the parents. There's other things going on here as well. I mean, you've got the standard problems that we've seen in lots and lots of other areas, not so much coronavirus in this case, but in things like the Communications Act 2003 with grossly offensive, which was used against Count Dankula, the Scottish comedian, with the saluting pug. You know, man trains his pug to do a Nazi salute, this kind of thing. So grossly offensive. You've got a term that is incapable of reasonable definition. Now you've got psychological harm being used in the draft of this bill. Now, the basic problem with all of this is the widening definition of harm. Everybody is trying to say that something harms them, and it's become completely out of control, and it's basically a vehicle for whingers.
Yeah. Well, this is what worries me, because it says here, the one thing that it says is the aim is to make Britain one of the safest places to be online in the world, especially for children. Well, I don't know whether these people have actually looked at the internet recently, but it's not actually possible to prevent the internet from operating from a different country. So, I mean, you can make Britain as safe as you like, but somebody can go and look at something that's available in France on the internet without actually going to France, unless you're going to start blocking, all websites.
Entire countries, yes.
Which I think they tried to do in China, and even in China you can get around it.
And it doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
No,
people go to China and they get on their own little private networks. The other thing here that worries me is it says platforms have a duty to protect journalistic content, but can still take down or block content or ban companies altogether, and this is the key bit, if they generate complaints. I mean, well, everyone generates complaints because people complain. It doesn't mean that they should be taken down.
And there's also the point here. You've got, yes, Ofcom is better. Having Ofcom do it is better than having Facebook or Twitter do it.
Yeah.
I mean, because they have some awareness of the environment in which they operate, and they are accountable to Parliament.
Yeah.
I mean, you saw the difference between Ofcom and YouTube when TalkRADIO's own YouTube channel was taken down, and Ofcom had nothing to do with that and put an enormous amount of distance between itself and the behaviour of YouTube.
Yeah.
But the point is, via the back door, in the form that this legislation is now, and you must remember it's in the form that it is now, it's basically saying, well, the way YouTube behaved then is acceptable as long as they do it like this.
Yeah.
But it's still conceding that it is entirely reasonable on the basis of people having a moan and having a grossly inflated sense of what hurts them or harms them. I mean, realistically, the appropriate response to someone who says, I find that psychologically hurtful, is literally go down to B&Q, get a spoonful of cement, stick it in your mouth, swallow it, and harden up.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, I've just had this.
I know.
I've just had people whinging about, someone called me a nasty name on the internet.
Yeah.
If I had £1 for every nasty name that I've ever been called in my life, given my age and where I grew up and my sexual orientation and so on and so forth, I would not need to appear on the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. I would not need to write any more novels or do any more journalism or do anything at all, because I would be able to retire.
Yes.
I would have so much money. This
exactly
is ridiculous.
Right. But how does this work legally as well, Helen? Because what we're looking at basically is an area which was previously not really policed by a government organisation. And now these media companies, by their own hand and through their own fault, in my view, are now being policed and regulated. Now, they might take the view that we don't wish to be regulated by a government organisation. So actually, maybe we won't bother operating in the UK.
Yes, and to be fair, I don't actually have a problem with that. I think globally, in developed countries, politics would be improved and civil society would be improved if Twitter just ceased to disappear. So if Twitter particularly decides to up sticks and go home and say we don't want to deal with Ofcom or HM Gov or so on and so forth, I don't actually particularly care, because I think it's a net negative.
We'd all have a lot more time on our hands, I would imagine.
Well, yes. Well, time on your hands to do other maybe productive things like work and not argue the toss over stupid
No, I mean, all the people that I know
nonsense.
that have either, for one reason or another, decided to just drop Twitter from their lives have all reported that, they're a lot happier and they have a lot more time to do, as you say, more sort of specifically creative things. Even Donald Trump's happier that he's off Twitter, I think.
I'm not surprised. Look, a lot of Trump's behaviour on Twitter was exactly the same if you wanted to get someone from the other side of the fence, of Professor Gopal, who's a total lefty.
Yes.
The one at Cambridge. But the behaviour is just very similar. These are people who get on social media and for whatever reason, it doesn't persuade them to change their mind. We know that's not the case now. But what it does is any character flaws they already have, and in this case, a tendency to be easily angered and to become rude in certain contexts. Yes. Those are traits that both of these people share. Are just amplified by Twitter and just made many, many, many times worse. And of course, if the person's got a lot of followers or is a powerful official like Trump was, you've got the situation of, it's very difficult for everybody else to ignore because of their behavior. But it's the way social media produces this. It's very important to keep clear in your head that social media or watching pornography on the internet or whatever it is you're doing on the internet doesn't change you in the sense of changing your views. It's very, very difficult to get any sort of broadcast media to make people change their minds. A lot of people think that it's easy, that propaganda is easy to do, and that they look at the Nazis or the communists, the Soviet Union back in the day, they think, well, their government managed to get everybody to all line up and face in the same direction. And it turns out that's actually not true. Right. That even in authoritarian, totalitarian states, propaganda is surprisingly ineffective and very hard to do well.
Yes, now, I would imagine in all of those situations that you've just described, it would be more the fear of what would happen if you didn't comply, rather than actually believing what you're being told.
Yes, it's not people believing what they've been told. It's the fact that the government has a monopoly on the coercive use of force, and they're willing to use it in an authoritarian way, which is what those dictatorships and various other modern dictatorships do it as well. And the thing is, it's getting harder and harder and harder to do. Even an authoritarian dictatorship that is very technologically advanced and competently governed in a way that neither Nazi Germany nor the Soviet Union were, China, even it can't keep Twitter out. Because a lot of Chinese people are tech savvy and they want to find out what people are discussing in other countries. And so they find ways of doing it. And my understanding is that in many respects that whilst they control Chinese people very heavily in terms of how they behave towards other Chinese in the context of the Chinese social credit system, that even the Chinese government has basically given up trying to stop people using VPNs to get hold of.
Yeah, they can't do it. I mean, I know
you would have to arrest every single Chinese person who uses a VPN, and I bet there's a lot of them.
Yes, and I think it's a pretty well-known fact that if anybody goes to China, they do that as well.
Yes, exactly. I know my partner did,
and they don't get. Yeah, and they don't, well,
that was like 2 years ago.
Of course, and that's what people do. But the worry about this whole setup, and I take your point that it's a green paper and it could well be, melted down or changed in one way, shape, or form.
Or never enacted because you can't enforce it. That's the other. Well,
that's the other thing. Yeah, because I mean the trouble is it's so vague, and Toby Young's pointed this out. Yes, there are some good protections for proper journalistic outfits, so that we, for example, would not be treated as if we were some conspiracy-based YouTube channel. We would be treated as a proper journalistic entity, but that doesn't protect other people, and it also doesn't protect anyone from complaints that are made about something, which apparently then have upset the apple cart and get taken down for one reason or another.
We see this is the problem with opening the door to, if lots of people complain about something, then it must be true. I mean, everyone who has worked in journalism has had the experience of the article that produces a deluge of letters to the editor, or fights on Twitter. You have had the experience, I'm sure, of seeing your switchboard glow in the dark after a particularly controversial segment. The BBC has had this. It doesn't matter what stripe you are or what background. There are certain things that just push people's buttons. And if you base regulation on, we'll take down all the things that push people's buttons, you will not have a free press. You won't necessarily have a controlled press either. What you will have, though, is an anodyne, boring press, and the opportunity for people to engage in the disputation and disagreement, the classic reasonable disagreement that you get in debate in a democracy, is taken away. The lifeblood of democracy it's just a way of draining it away in the name of protecting people from psychological harm. I mean, we've all heard the joke, and I think it probably goes back to the Napoleonic Wars, but it may even go back to antiquity, that an army marches at the pace of its slowest soldier. You cannot design the whole of civilization and the whole of civil society for the weakest among us. No. For people who are easily influenced, who are easily made to feel weak or sad because someone said a mean word to them.
Yes. Well, I mean, it takes us back, does it not? It takes us back to the COVID situation where we're being told now that hopefully by June the 21st, mask wearing will no longer be mandatory. People might still wear masks on public transport, but not in shops, not in offices, not on the street. However, there will still be people who will say, but I want to wear one because I'm nervous and I'm frightened, and that's fine. Wear one then.
Let them do it.
But don't make everybody else do it.
And this is the thing, running yourself on fear and weakness. I mean, there's a psychiatrist in America who calls this the great untruth. His name's Jonathan Haidt, and he makes the comment that people who run around thinking that instead of it's a maxim of Roman Stoicism, which is what does not kill me makes me stronger. Okay, so the idea that if you can tough it out, you come out at the other end a stronger and better person. And it was made famous by Nietzsche, but he nicked it off the Roman Stoics. and that was a civilization that valued toughness and psychological resilience.
Yes.
And interestingly, both men and women. But it's a true thing. It's the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy when you go and get treatment if you're terribly frightened of snakes or spiders. And I'm going to use those as an example because they're Australian and lots of people are frightened of them because they're poisonous.
Yes.
But there are ways of managing that.
Well, I'm not frightened of spiders here, but I think I would be frightened of spiders in Australia.
Because, they can kill you.
Yeah, and
but
they're very big as well.
There are ways of managing that fear. And a big part of it is confronting the fear and pushing through it. And so, for example, you get kids who are very frightened of snakes, and they're taken to a vivarium and to look at them, and to be in the same room as the snake, and so on and so forth. It's a way of overcoming that fear. And so you got all of these people just running away from anything that makes them frightened. And the point is, they're going over the cliff. That's fine. You want to jump over the cliff, you do that by yourself. Yeah. But what they're trying to do is take everybody else with them and say, well, I could be psychologically harmed, you could be too. So that means everybody has to be quiet when I want to have a moan.
Well,
and I'm
I've
sorry,
often
that's when
said
my
this.
B&Q advice applies
Yes,
there. You know, seriously,
indeed.
spoonful of cement, harden up.
Yeah, no, I've always said to my kids that, you know, being brave does not mean you're not frightened. It just means that you're overcoming the fear, but you're still frightened, but you do it anyway, because that's what you have to learn to do. It's a fascinating conversation. I'm sure we'll be having more of it. Let's talk a little bit about the election and the voter ID issue as well, because you wanted to touch upon that.
Well, yes.
Why are the left of this country and maybe other countries so frightened of voter ID? I don't buy that there's millions of people that don't have ID. I just don't believe that.
Yeah, well, part of it once again is the inevitable importing of American debates to the UK and to other countries. Now, I'm going to get very Australian here, even if the accent isn't quite strong enough. When it comes to matters of electoral debates and electoral reform and the administration of elections, the United States should be ignored. It should be ignored because it is incompetent. This is a country that on the Harvard University, Sydney University annual ratings of the Electoral Integrity Project, which I strongly recommend you look at, the United States is the lowest ranked actual democracy. It comes in at 57th in last year's. Right. These people cannot run an election. They have enormous problems, and you don't even have to accept anything or even 1% of the arguments that Donald Trump was making about election fraud after the election last year. But the point is, even excluding everything that he said, US elections are badly run, they are slow, there is widespread fraud, the redistricting is designed often quite deliberately between two political parties to make it easier for them to have a banana-shaped electorate that keeps all their voters together and all of this. It's just nonsense.
Their counting system and even their actual physical voting system, I don't even know if they still use those crazy levers that they used to use.
Yeah, they still do.
But I mean, that's the most arcane system I think I've ever seen.
Yeah, and the thing is, the system of voting using pencils and paper with a pre-printed ballot provided by the electoral authority is actually an Australian innovation. Australians developed it first. Also, the using of little stalls so that no one else can see you vote in the booth. The actual physical booth was also originally developed in Australia. For so long, it was even when it was first developed and then copied globally, even Americans used to call it the Australian ballot. Right. You know, if you could see speeches by John F. Kennedy where you read the transcript and he talks about the Australian ballot. So if you are going to copy an electoral system, this is one where I do say, copy the Australian one, learn how it works. They don't need voter ID in Australia, and they have compulsory voting. Everyone has to turn up, and they fine you if you don't. Yes. I've always said my approach to countries that introduce voter ID where there isn't a history of a shockingly administered electoral system like in the US, like the UK has generally had clean elections. And in some respects, this bill is a response to what happened in Tower Hamlets with Lutfur Rahman, you know, and the behaviour of treating electors and trying to get all the local mosques to tell everyone that you're a bad Muslim unless you vote for Lutfur and this kind of thing. All of this stuff is very, very bad behaviour. And they're trying to use voter ID to stop that from happening. But the thing is, Lutfur Rahman's behaviour did not depend on plural voting in the way that you think. It depended on scaring people based on their religious beliefs.
So you're saying voter ID wouldn't make any difference to that?
No. And also it did involve with him and also the incident up in Birmingham, which was very bad, where you had sacks of votes being delivered to people and they were all being filled in by one person. Yeah. That was fraud on the postal vote system. And the way you deal with that is you don't have postal votes as of right. In Australia, you have to be an eligible voter to become a postal voter. You know, this kind of thing. And lots of people are eligible. I mean, it was originally introduced in Australia, and I'm going to recommend a book. It's called From Secret Ballot to Democracy Sausage by Judith Brett, who's an Australian political scientist. Now, it's quite difficult to get through Amazon. You'll have to buy it from Book Depository, and it will take a little while to be delivered because obviously it was never published in the UK. It's an Australian book. But it explains in nice, clear language how the Australian electoral system developed, how it is administered, and basically gives you an idiot's guide to copying it. Because this system, the Australian system, is the cleanest in the world.
Yeah.
They don't need voter ID.
Well, maybe we should have
Yes.
a look at that, because I'm not sure about compulsory voting in this country, but it's certainly worth checking out, I would imagine. Helen, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you, as ever, for your contribution. Helen Dale, writer, lawyer, political commentator, with her take on the voter ID situation, but more importantly, probably on this online harms bill. You should have a look. I'm going to tweet out a story about it very shortly. Have a look and read it and see what you think of it, and let us know. 0344 499 1000 is the number. This is Talk Radio.